Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat tonight because I recently did a live stream here at MythVision with a scholar who thinks that maybe mostly everything we're reading in Josephus is authentic, other than maybe a word or two or three. But we have other scholars who have different views, different takes, and we're going to get a different take tonight. And so without wasting any time, I have Dr. Richard C. Miller joining us again. How you doing?
Hey, Derek. It's good to see you, man. It's good to be on the show again. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you coming on, man. You hit me up and you were like, we should look closer at the Greek here because I'm reading this and it sounds a bit like what is written in this Flavius Josephus Testimonium Flavianum. It sounds liturgical. It sounds very churchy and not so negative. And so, okay, I'm not an expert. I total cards on the table. I cannot read these languages, but you can. You not only know, Greek, but you also can dig into the Latin. You know the Latin, a little bit of Syriac. You know what I mean? Like you're dabbling with things beyond just Greek. And why, if I will up front, I just want to ask everybody who's tuning in, like, hit the like button, check out Dr. Miller's book. I just dropped a review recently. We'll show that on the screen here, but why does this stick out to you as not authentic, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, so I'm going to have a very different take than your last guest on there. No shade on him, but I just get excited about these topics. I think it is important in terms of understanding Christian origins. This particular entry in Josephus, he was a qualified historian in antiquity. Now, there are parts where he did embellish here and there, but he did a pretty good job in terms of giving us, he's the most vivid description of the Levant during that period in terms of Roman governance and the problems that are going on and so forth. And so he gets into book 18, and what I'm seeing is this jarring, dislocated, kind of pasted on segment there. I've got the kind of the guild behind me, so to speak, here in terms of the consensus is that this was doctored by later Christians, maybe 4th century, something like this, or, along the way. A lot of them are saying that it was doctored repeatedly along the way, which I find difficult to swallow exactly, and we'll get into that here. But yeah, so I've got that consensus there that's kind of behind me. So this is the status quo position in that way, but I've got a new take on this that's even more radical still. And so I want to unpack that a little bit in terms of what I think is going on.
You have a radical position? There's no way you could possibly have a radical. I mean, come on, man. You're not only the guy who really gave us the juice when it came to recognizing that missing body motif and what that meant to us. How does that reflect, right? But yeah, based on our conversation, I would say it's an interesting perception, and I love taking on different angles, different views, considering what's going on. We don't have a time machine, so it's important that we're able to consider these things and think through them. So without further ado, we're talking Josephus. If you're just tuning in, did he write what we're seeing there? Well, the consensus thinks it's been doctored up. I don't know if the consensus is that it's total interpolation. I think the consensus tends to lean there is authenticity there, but it has been so doctored up that we're not sure what the original was. Some try to reconstruct it. Some play into the game of going, we think something was negative there, right? We're going to talk about, maybe you can explain a little briefly without reading the whole chapter, around the section, which makes us think you wouldn't have inserted something in here if it wasn't negative. It seemed to be obvious that this is not a good place to put your guy, or something positive about Jesus. So roll out the carpet however you will, Dr. Miller.
Well, sure. So we've got a historian in the first century who's trying to provide a description of kind of his ethnic people, the Jews, the Hebrew people, and so forth, going all the way back into antiquity. And so it's called Antiquities of the Jews. And there's, this is similar to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who wrote a similar high-statured work called Antiquities of the Romans, and so Roman Antiquities. And so you've got, and there's a lot going on there in terms of mimetic. Like, he seems to be using that in some ways as a template or a model that he's emulating in some way to write a grand history of his own people in this way. And so there's some embellishment in there. He wants to present it, give it the best presentation possible.
Right.
And so you get to this point, though, in Book 18. Now he's already moved all the way up through all this history, and now he's dealing with the governance of Judea. Pontius Pilate is in there, just challenges and difficulties that the Romans are facing in terms of governing this region. And he's setting this up as kind of a pretext for the Jewish revolt. And so what are the causes and conditions leading up to that? Now, there's something we all need to recognize here. This is not a Christian text. It's really not even a Jewish text. This is a Roman text. This is paid for by the Roman government. So he is under the commission of the emperor to write this stuff. And so he's on the payroll. We're going to go to Eusebius later. He's also on the Roman government payroll doing his research project. And so these are Roman publications, so to speak, to put that in quotes in terms of what ancient writing was. And so these were writings that were governed by, commissioned by, and controlled by the Roman government to some extent. And so, and continued to be so throughout, through the rest of late antiquity. And so.
Is that important as far as my understanding is when he writes History of the Jews, he's clearly writing for a Jewish through the Jewish lens is my understanding. Whereas when he's writing the wars, this is painted toward a Roman audience and clearly geared that way.
I would say they both are delivered to a Roman audience. So he wants to present, he wants to put the best foot forward in antiquities. He wants to put the best, he wants to paint his people in the best light. And he was commissioned because he's the most they saw him as the most qualified. And so he gets quoted often by others. And so the major libraries, the biggest ones throughout the empire, talking about Alexandria, talking about Pergamum, talking about Athens and Rome, and maybe Caesarea Maritima. These kinds of places were the places in civic libraries where this would have been archived and held. And so that's where, and so the idea that Christians are coming along and invading these libraries and rewriting it, I think that's a point that I want to challenge in kind of what I'm presenting here. And so, yeah, these weren't Christian writings. They weren't governed by Christians, now quoted by Christians, but accessed in civic library contexts. And so, and that's
what is the scandal here? What do you think is the ultimate scandal? I mean, obviously we're going to come to a conclusion, but my understanding is that Christians, for the most part, didn't quote this section at all till much later.
Right. It gets brought up, but it gets pulled into Josephus or Eusebius rather. He's not a great historian. He's also presenting a highly propagandistic kind of. We've gone into this in some prior videos, actually. Highly propagandistic, theologically kind of controlled presentation of Christian history, in quotes, and he even admits that he's having a hard time pulling that together. But one of the pieces that he brings in there is an excerpt out of this section called the Testimonium Flavianum, and so that's the text that's under consideration in the video here with you. And so it's a piece, a chunk, a block of text that's in there, maybe several sentences that don't fit. They don't fit his personality Now, I've read it in Greek too, and I know Schmidt was saying that there's some hidden aspect of this that does somehow align with him. I've read a lot of Josephus and translated, truckloads and truckloads of Josephus. This does not fit his language, his tone, his persona, his meta narrative in the chapter. What is he trying to accomplish in the chapter? Is he trying to flatter people that are getting executed by the Roman government? Is that his goal in the chapter? I don't think so. And so, and what is his larger arc in terms of the story he's telling? He's trying to get all the way to the Jewish war and the causes and conditions, the aggravations that, produced that. And so, yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's worth drawing the picture leading up to the section about the Testimonium Flavianum, so people understand how positive all the material around this section.
Well, yeah. So he kicks off book 18. Now, these are books, so that means that book in quotes, segments of writing that could have discrete mobility and recopied in discrete sections and this kind of thing. And so a book, each writer would have their work would be divided up into books. And so we're looking at book 18, which is, referenced as such in other writings in antiquity. And so we know we're looking at the right place, and they haven't messed with that. And so, so you've got Judas the Galilean, who starts a revolt, is very similar. You've got a disciple of Jesus' name, actually, or a named person that has a similar name to or the same name as one of Jesus' own disciples from the same neck of the woods. He's a Galilean, and so nothing good comes out of Galilee, right? And so, and he's starting a taxation revolt, which sounds a lot like stuff in the gospel, at least kind of the nervous kind of topics that are raised up in the gospel, the canonical gospels, that is. And so he starts this kind of movement, a revolt movement, where they are basically wanting to throw off the Roman government and say, we are God's people and why are you here, and this kind of thing. And it starts to look like a threat, as you would predict. Crimes are being committed. There are actual laws on the books in Roman law to not be doing this kind of thing, assembling and fomenting sedition and this kind of thing. And so it gets stamped out, and predictably. And so it gets crushed by the Roman government. They look at that and they go, no, that's not what we're going to allow to happen. And so understandably, they're trying to, it's a tenuous kind of governance in that area. And so they're keeping their eye out for any kind of problems. And so Josephus is starting to record some of these serious problems that are percolating through that time period. And so that's the first guy that gets kind of airtime in the chapter, or in the book, rather.
And I hear from some scholars that this would have been negative, clearly. Whatever was originally there, it would have not looked good for Jesus at all. And you're saying when you read it, it gives off the vibes that it sounds more pro rather than neutral or negative. Is that your point of view?
Oh, it's not just pro, it's unbelievably pro. It's unbelievably pro. And I mean that literally. It's meant not to be believed. The scribe, let me throw down my hypothesis here that I think is solid. The scribe who wrote it in a rebellious mentality, a rebellious mindset, who was forced to redact over the top of what was originally there, breaking all of his professional codes. These were civic texts. You don't mess with them. And this would be the only exception that stands out at all of that in the history of ancient Greek and Roman literature. And so, so you've got this, so they're commissioned, this is my theory, they're commissioned to rewrite this segment in book 18, to replace book 18 in the major civic libraries. And with having rewritten this block of text and maybe a little bit of liquid paper over some of John the Baptist stuff there as well, in order to make these guys look like, wonderful beacons of divine, wisdom and wonder worker. Jesus is a wonder worker. He's the Christ. in the Greek, there's unambiguous. There is no funny play there going on. It's using the same kind of sacred language that you would expect through that period from Christian hands. And so it's highly creedal. And so, and then he raises on the third day, and his people who loved him stick with him, and they're there with us even to this day. And so that's the segment that's there. He performs paradoxes, the paradoxography or whatever. You've had Robin Faith Walsh on talking about that. Well, it does use that word in there in Greek for the wonder working, and the he's a thaumaturgist. He's a person that creates these kind of spectacles, miraculous spectacles. This is what's going on in Josephus' description, and that just so happens to be precisely aligned with Nicene orthodoxy and all that's going on in Rome in the early 4th century. And so
what also blows me away personally, and I'm hesitant on accepting something like that as even being what we have, like anything we could trust, is that it wasn't just Jews, but he had Greek followers, right? And I'm thinking to myself, that seems to be, from my understanding of Christianity, which maybe this is circular, but still is a Pauline innovation, is that we are now incorporating goyim. We're looking for the ethne. We're trying to go after the nations. Jesus wasn't after the nations. In fact, we get hints in Matthew. He's saying, do not go to anyone but the Jews. And so you're like, oh, okay. So why does Josephus have these theologically developed Pauline post his death innovations, if this isn't at least somewhat influenced by Christian thought? Which one could then argue, well, okay, Josephus is just working off of Christians who are telling him that Jesus did this. Okay, that's an option. But you're suggesting in your reading of the Greek, and maybe we should pull up the English translation, that it appears more positive toward Jesus and not so neutral, or not so, well, there was a guy and his name was Jesus and people believed he was this. You're saying it sounds miraculous about this guy.
It's confessional. It's confession. Like, who else? You would walk away if you didn't know any better. If you just read that segment, you'd walk away going, okay, clearly Josephus was the most dedicated Christian I've ever heard of. Clearly, he's checking all the boxes, right? And so, and it says there that there's a fulon, that is a tribe, a nation, an entire clan of,
I'm gonna pull it up,
followers, even to this day. No, it was a fledgling movement at the time of Josiah. There was no tribe. There was no giant, like, ethnic, distinctive, like, group that everyone would have recognized at that point, clearly. And so
I figure I'd bring this up just so people could see your English translation here of the Greek. And then we have the Latin or English translation of the Latin from Jerome, and Syriac as well, which you're going to want to explain this. So I guess if I'm understanding you, and so the audience is fully grasping everything here, you are suggesting that it is pretty obvious to you just by reading Josephus in the Greek that something, it looks pro-Jesus in a way that Josephus wouldn't have had a pro-Jesus-y type of message, especially not in the context, not with the usage of the theological terms he uses here. But your hypothesis is that when Christians do get into power, correct me if I'm wrong, emphasize anything, tell me I'm wrong, Derek, or actually you're right, but I want to take it a step further. When Christians do get into power in the coming 200 to 300 years after the rise, especially by the late third into the 4th centuries, there is a dedicated commission by emperors who are in power, or someone in power who has the financial capability and the know-how to go into the regions where they would have had Josephus material, because this was not in everybody's house. This was clearly in library, very upper elite type educational areas, and to go and find them like you would a modern library and tweak these sections amongst this material so that Jesus is painted favorably and not in a negative light. Yes,
swap out the book is probably what happened there. Like book 18, They probably sent them. My thesis is they sent. Who else would be able to do this? Christians couldn't have done it. They didn't control all these libraries. And so once you've got Constantine changing, the governing power at that time, the huge swing that took place. Now, when he became a Christian, that doesn't mean the entire empire just flipped a switch and everybody's Christianized suddenly. That just wasn't the case. But you did have then the state-sanctioned religion at that time became Christianity. That's a big deal in Roman government because they wed those two things together. Politics and religion were fused as one thing in the Roman mind. It wasn't, they weren't separated at all. And so allegiance to the emperor, allegiance to the emperor cult, allegiance to the emperor's religion, allegiance to the state-sanctioned religion, these were all one and the same in allegiance to the Roman Empire itself. And so, so this idea then that you've got this horribly embarrassing text that is the only one that survives from that time period that is giving description of the context and things of the paragon of that particular religion, the founding figure, the most sacred figure of the religion. So what was there? What caused them? It must have been so embarrassing or so upsetting that they felt the need to go out and send out that commission to replace that text, because it was, I would call it a stain without using profane words here.
The stain of Christian origins.
It was an ugly text. And we know this because even Origen in the 3rd century, he had the ugly text in front of him. And he says that Josephus said that he was not the Christ. Josephus rejected the idea in his book 18. He rejected that this should be regarded as the Christ. And so what more was there? That's the question on the table, because the text we get, the one that survives, the one that I am proposing was intentionally by royal edict altered. That text unambiguously stated that he was the Christ. And so you can see it there in the Greek.
If I may read it just in English for our viewers.
Yeah.
About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man. That doesn't sound very negative already. Just saying. If indeed one ought to call him a man. Well, I don't know how I would, I don't know. For he was one,
It's ridiculous. There's no way.
He was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. Come on. Okay. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. That sounds post-Jesus, at least Pauline, right? He was believed to be the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to the cross. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them on the 3rd day, restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him.
Yeah.
Come on, dude. You're a Christian. You're a Christian.
1,000 other marvels. Go ahead.
Yeah. So called after him has still to this day not disappeared. The tribe that is called after him. Sorry. Tribe of Christians.
Yeah. Now, read in context, we just grabbed that out. That might as well have been out of any of the church fathers right there. Any one of them could have said more or less precisely the same thing, and probably not better. And so what I'm proposing here is that the scribe was not on board with this. They did not want to do this. And so they made it intentionally as jarring as possible, as a gesture of kind of defiance, so that others that came along later would read this and know this is not the voice of Josephus. This is not original. This is something that's been pasted over the top. and so they were forced to have to write, positive things, but I think they intentionally did it as obtusely and artlessly as possible. Now, what scribe would be so stupid, obtuse, and artless as to say, okay, here's what we're going to put there? I don't think this goes against anybody that would have touched this text. These were professional writers. If someone were to go in there and try and alter this text, they would have altered it in ways that would have been at least halfway compelling, and as something, okay, this sounds like Josephus' voice here. But there's all sorts of language in there that's not Josephine. He's not flattering toward any of the other sign prophets, the people that he brings out. Right at the end of this story, to continue the jarring kind of, it says, what does it say? It says, and then another horrible outrage burst forth on the scene with the Jews, or something.
Assuming there was a prior one, which is where this section was. Is your point?
Yeah. That was 3, section 3, 4, which is the next statement, the next sentence right after what you just wrote. We get, about this time, another outrage threw the Jews into tumult.
It seems obvious that there's something.
Like, I think the person that popped this in there, that they were told to do this, and it violated their own their career, their code of conduct, and their career. You don't go writing over the top of a work that you're trying to preserve from the ancient. You just don't do that. We don't have other records of people doing this. It's not a thing. And so, especially the civic Roman, Greek, and Roman works, you just don't do this. And so, this would have been, I think, the only person that would have had the power, the only group, the aristocrats, the Senate, and the emperor would have been the only folks that would have had enough power to go out there into all of the empire and change every book 18 that's out there. And I don't think it was just, liquid paper. I think they had to swap out the entire book. And that would have been expensive. It would have been a major update. You would think that if this were just kind of text critical slippage over time, that you would have recensions surviving that, or at least notes about it or something. You'd see some evidence somewhere of something, of the survival of the original. And we just don't have that. All we have are later slightly softened versions of the same thing that we get in Eusebius, that goes all the way back to all our manuscript tradition regarding Josephus himself in Greek. And so,
there's something to throw out there. Okay, so we don't have Marcion's Evangelion. We have to, people reconstructing this stuff, right? And there was one, but we don't have it. In fact, his writings are only preserved through the heresiologist and those who are quoting, but there's nothing of him, right? Now, he's a problem because he's a Christian who's actively got a viral message that's clearly catching wind all over the Roman Empire and is competing with these other Christians, right? So there's good reason to compete and argue directly with him. Yeah. Whereas you're saying when Origen quotes, Origen knows of this negative thing. He's aware of something we don't have.
Yes.
I wish we had it quoted, but it's evident because in his own book, he mentions that he sees Vespasian as the Messiah. So there's no reason. I know that if you read Josephus, Vespasian is the prophesied Messiah. There would be no reason to assume he would say Jesus was not the Messiah if he's looking at this section going, it's what we have. Because clearly you could see with what we have, you could see him maybe being sympathetic and clearly being Christian by all the things with the miracles and the prophecies and the resurrection and all of that. So what I'm saying, I guess if I'm going to try and be critical back, is to say this. Is it really more probable? Let me do a hypothetical with you, Rick.
Okay.
Is it more probable that they sent and commissioned people to go and change all these books, or that we're misunderstanding and they did a little tweak here and there, maybe a couple Greek words, and it's more neutral and negative?
People have tried to do that. They've tried to. There's a number of scholars. I'll not name any names, but it's pretty popular. That's kind of the consensus view, is that there's vestiges there of the original, and that there's some word changes or something in there, just a few word changes, and that's it.
You think it's like complete interpolation?
The problem is you just read it. Which words are you going to take out of there and still have something that sounds even remotely like Josephus still? Like nothing. You can't. Was he a wise man that that had people that loved the truth following him? Is that what went on? Because Josephus doesn't have anything flattering to say about any of the other troublemakers that he's describing in chapter 18. And he's going on to talk about people that upset the emperor, upset the local authorities, and got stamped out, got killed, crucified. This is the meta narrative coming across that chapter. And then you get to Jesus, and it's a tiptoe. You're just kind of dancing through creedal, kind of this creedal garden of joy, and then you get on to the next section, and there's just more. Goes right back to this heavy kind of tone, without any kind of announcement or modal shift there in the narration. So it's, in my opinion, you can't, like one person wanted to keep in there that he was a wise man and all this stuff. Was he? He got executed, and he was causing trouble in the area. Like, what other you don't see Josephus running about describing people in these terms. It's not part of how he sees his project.
Yeah, that's the red flag. While I was reading it, I was thinking, especially I wish we had the whole section brought up for the audience. I literally just got home from trying to find homes, right? I'm at my house. I would have brought the whole section up for everybody to read before and after. But your point, all of these messianic claimants, we have to keep in mind with this Roman project you're talking about, this is pro-Vespasian. This is Vespasian's dynasty. Actually, this is not Neronic. This is Vespasian dynasty. This is Titus and Vespasian and their pedigree. And that means anyone who's claiming messianic claim, anyone who's an insurrectionist in any type of messianic Joshua type figure, Samaritan, the Egyptian, they're all not good dudes.
Yeah.
And then the way he paints Jesus here does not feel, I don't feel the negativity here. I don't feel any negativity in the English translation, but is there more? I guess we had a super chat. In fact, it might be worth bringing that up. Nope, it's not related to that. We'll get to the super chat here. Do you feel in the Greek, it's a little stronger to you that it's actually pro rather than trying to understand this in a different tone?
It's unambiguous, and the Greek isn't all that complex that's in that segment. It's New Testament kind of, caliber Greek in terms of its complexity and grammatical sophistication, the grammar, the language, the word choices, and this sort of thing. It's not difficult Greek. And he's unambiguous on all these terms there. And so now other scholars have come on and said, like Steve Mason, I huge respect. This is somebody that spent his whole life just sitting down and translating truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of Josephus. And he comes to this section and he observes the same thing, that this is jarring. This is absolutely jarring. This does not fit. Now, he may draw the line somewhere different than where I draw. There's a lot of people, it's popular right now in the inertia of the field to try and find something here that's residue of what was originally there. Mm-hmm. I don't see a need to do that. If they had whoever had the ability to go out and change all of these copies out in the empire also had the payroll to go ahead and change it, to redact the whole thing. And so there's no reason to like, hey, let's keep 5 words here. What's the point?
I see what you mean. Like that's a very difficult thing to think through, right? I don't know. That's a very interesting point you bring up. Like, who sat at the desk, approached the library? Hey, I'm John. Yeah, Constantine sent me. I'll just be here for a couple weeks. And they take so much time and energy trying to figure out how they're going to rework this section instead of just coming in and going, hey, we've got the same thing we pretty much want to insert. and we're going to find the places and we're just swapping out the books, almost like they already had the work done beforehand, or they may have that book 18 or a section that they're just going to replace that made it really easy to do. I don't know.
I'm not a conspiracy guy, but all of my logical trains lead to this hypothesis. I don't have another theory that satisfies me, like that somehow it was just lightly doctored by someone, or just even Eusebius. I mean, a lot of people want to say Eusebius is responsible. I don't know. I don't think he was. He was pretty decent at quoting other people. I don't see him making a lot of like wild, he wasn't. He was propagandistic, but not really deceptive in the sense of like, hey, let's swap out entire classic works with other text. That's not the way he operated. And so I would see it as prior to him in some way, not long prior to him, like within a decade or whatever, when he wrote, probably before him though. And that volume got swapped out in Rome, in the civic library they had there. And throughout the empire and the other locations. And so I think that's the best explanation. It's the only one that makes sense to me of the data at this point. Now, what was in there originally? If you start to draw lines, as David Allen is an Irish friend of mine who we talk a lot, as you start to draw lines with the other sign prophets and the other characterizations that Josephus is prone to make regarding such figures, well, you end up with a pattern there that probably is pretty close, approximates what was probably there. And it was a stain. It was probably ugly. It wasn't a nice, flattering picture.
I mean, imagine you're Josephus. You literally just dropped. I mean, you're doing like Lucian, but negative to these sign prophets. Oh, this guy got beheaded because he's a dummy and he thought he was going to split the Jordan River, and he had this many people, and this guy, he did this, and then what we know about Jesus, even with the Gospels, which paint him in the most favorable possible light, because we're getting the propaganda from Christianity. What you're seeing is someone who literally goes into the temple, starts whipping people and screaming and yelling at them. Okay. Right. It's like going today into the Capitol building in the United States with a whip, and you start like actually hitting people. Okay. And like, obviously we're not in ancient Rome. They'll just kill you there. Whereas here we'll get arrested and go through due process and all that. But like, if you're Josephus and you see all these sign prophets and they're not your good guys, Vespasian's your good guy and you're pro Vespasian here, you're going to get to Jesus and it's got to be something scathing. It's got to be. You cannot not.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I think what colors the lens from modern time is we've got the Christianized West. You got mostly Christians that are viewing this. And so there's this really strong kind of momentum for folks to want this to be a good picture, a good beginning, the origin. That's why there's this obsession with the origin, right? Is everyone wants to get back in there and find some wonderful figure that's behind all this somewhere. And so not all of us, but, I just really want to know what really happened. I don't care how wonderful or non-wonderful it was, but when you look at the early Christian records, even through their own self-propagandistic literature, well, they're constantly having to work with this idea of their own innocence in the face of getting prosecuted for crimes. And so there's a lot of criminality going on. You got John the Baptist, who's breaking Roman laws, causing trouble, degrading Herod and so forth, and causing trouble. And this is the nice version. What would the ugly version look like? What would the version that's not meant to, promote Christianity look like? And then the same thing with Jesus. What would the non-promotional perspective here? He gets prosecuted. He goes through basically the Sanhedrin and is faced with the local magistrates and ends up executed, has to answer for himself, and they kill him. And they have him aligned next to, so the Gospels are doing considerable work to try and distance himself from sedition, Barabbas and all this stuff. So underneath that, we can imagine that he was perceived as seditious. And going into the temple and having this like anger fit, I think we're only getting the tip of the iceberg in the Gospels there, that there is more. And they had to report that tip because there was so much more that went on. For them to act like nothing happened there would have been too big of a pill for everyone to swallow, as these texts originally kind of dawned on the scene. And so, because there was a reputation, there was in circulation among other people the real story, right? Like what really happened was still probably in living memory for some people, at least early on. And so, yeah, and so you've got Josephus, who's in the know. He even your last guest had talked about how he knows, people that are part of the Sanhedrin. He knows Roman law. He knows, the process. He knows all of this. And he knows also the propensity of revolt and troublemaking and all this stuff going on. And so he wants to bring out this other person as well as part of the kind of what he's arraying there in describing the period. And so, yeah, I think you've got the Great Fire. We can get into that in another video.
I was just going to ask you.
Yeah, Tacitus, it says that Christians came forward and confessed to having started that fire in Rome that burned down half of the city in 64. And so you've got, and they confess and they get punished so severely, not so much that they had started the fire, whether that's by accident or whatever, but because they were perceived and confessed to doing it out of spite, out of apocalyptic zeal, which was interpreted as hatred toward humanity, misanthropic kind of intentions. And so Nero said, okay, was cruelly punishing towards them over that, because he felt like that was a worse crime to do that with such intentionality and kind of vehement kind of spirit. And so, and you get in Revelation praise and rejoicing. In verse, in chapter 18, the Christians are rejoicing that Rome's burning, and that this is somehow a great thing. And can you imagine a major city in the United States that's half burned to the ground, and some religious group thinks that's great?
Yeah,
that's disturbing. Whether that's in their mythology or not almost doesn't even matter. Just that attitude is in the air, that this is, something great that happened.
The image you're painting here could be used to try and reconstruct or reconsider thinking through why there's so much martyrdom mythology in early Christianity. Not saying every account is historical, but if there is a kernel here, and it's not, we're just soft, lovey-dovey, gentle doves running around giving a Christian message, but a coercive movement that is apocalyptic and antagonistic to society, breaking laws, then it makes sense when you get these extremes, pendulum swinging narratives. For example, they can't leave out that he was in the temple trying to cleanse it, or creating ruckus that was extreme and fighting against the elites of the time, disrupting social status and also like potentially breaking laws. But then also Acts comes in and literally paints this I think it's fictive. I mean, I would do this for any text, by the way. I would do this for any religion that would honestly do this. So please don't think this is just me picking on Christianity, but like, I'm reading Acts. There's all the red flags. Like, it's literally miracle from A to Z through the whole book. So I'm kind of like already biased that way. But every time, Theophilus, don't worry, let me give you the accurate accounts. And every single time they are accused by who? Every time? Jews. And they are saved every time by Romans. And there's like this endless, they're accused of this. Nope. They're found innocent. They're accused of this. And I think that's why they don't show you the death of Paul at the end, because he's probably really guilty, but he really dies. And so they just leave that out. Let's just end this book.
We don't want to deal with that. That kind of works against the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least their particular narrative, it seems. So
I think that's right. And I think just the idea that they're going from city to city and causing riots and problems. And this is in the best picture, right? This is the propagandistic legendary picture that Acts is trying to craft. But even there, he can't get away from the ugly parts of the history where this is causing trouble and tumult in major cities. And you can't help but recognize that they knew where the lines were at. They knew that they were doing this. This is like this innocent thing that let's go from town to town and spread the message and but not cause any trouble. They knew they were going to cause trouble. They knew the outcomes of some of this. Let's go right into the synagogue and start, coming at people, or let's go right on Mars Hill or whatever and start instructing the philosophers about whatever. And so there's this kind of mythology that's very confrontational. I want to take this all the way in front of, Felix or in front of Caesar himself. And, let's get this in front of the most powerful people as possible so we can, and as almost like a stunt. And then soon enough, they're in front of the most powerful people, and they're having these, as we talked about, fed to the lions, and, these kind of big martyrdom exhibitions that are meant to scandalize and so forth. And so there's this subversive kind of virtue it's a subversive movement that sees that as a higher activism. Mm. And so, but knows that it's intentionally aggravating and so how he set his face like flint to go to Jerusalem, right? Well, what's he doing? Well, he's telling his disciples, I'm going to go there and get killed. I'm going to go there and get myself killed. And I'm going to go there and create such a ruckus that they're going to fast track me through their legal system and have me killed almost instantly. And so there were other religious leaders and people through that period that didn't have that experience. And so this was unnecessary. Therefore, I would say this is part of the strategy, at least in these documents. Now, what happened historically, we can make a distance there, but at least in the documents, this strategy is blueprinted over and over. Kind of this aggravating, we're the good people. We're causing more trouble. And
it's funny, you sent me the link to Ignatius, his letter to the Romans, and Ignatius, yeah, because it's highly wild. I always repeat this whenever anyone's watching. In one of the chapter titles, it's "I want to die." Okay, yeah. Literally, the title of the chapter is this: "I want to die." And in it, he explains how he is taken by these beasts. He's talking about these Roman soldiers. They're going to take him, of course, to kill him or to put him on trial. It says he's like on trial of some sort. And he says that if they won't kill me, he says, I will ensure that they do. He gives you the heads up. Don't try to save me, brethren. Thank you. Pray for me that I may attain to God. He uses that language a lot because he wants to die so that he can attain godhood, to be there with God.
I think it even says that he's going to provoke the lions and animals to eat him, like intentionally. Yep. If they won't do it quickly or get to it, then he's going to try and And so that's a psychology that I don't think people in the modern world understand too well.
The closest thing I could think of, honestly, is a form of jihad. That's the closest thing I can come to thinking of that relates to it. It's martyrdom, even if it isn't necessary. Well, it could be burning of Rome. It could be, there are forms that may have popped its head up. And then later, when you see in history, I've read a few scholars on this that point out that Christians, once they've politicized and they found justification for war and coercive methods using the sword rather than turn the other cheek, the empires that had apocalyptic fervor and actually started to change this martyrdom from dying for Jesus to fighting and dying in war for Jesus. So you want to go to heaven, be a soldier for Christ and die in combat, and you immediately go to heaven. So they've reinterpreted their theology to match the conquest of empire. And this is where Islam picks up its tricks as well, when the Sasanians and the Constantinople are constantly at battle. Islam is just sitting there, or the Muslims in Arabia are just taking notes, watching empires do this very thing, and the theology is just draining down into Arabia. This is how they picked up much of their material.
Yeah, no, I agree. What is the thing about the kind of the myth with Constantine that, he sees the symbol of the cross or whatever in the sky, and then, in this name conquer, or whatever, under this symbol conquer. And it's ironic. It's almost horrifying in some ways, because you think of the cross as supposed to symbolize the opposite of that in some way.
Right.
But you kind of wonder, okay, how was the ancient mind processing this in terms of kind of martyrdom ideology and all of this? And so kind of taking that turn that you're talking about there.
Again, you gave me the sources for Josephus, the Greek English translation of the Greek. You gave me the English of the Jerome and Syriac. We don't need to cover those either, right? You just saying there's minor differences.
No, I mean, my theory with that is that, some people have tried to argue that you see evolution the other direction. I see it the other way, in terms of, like, I think that the redaction that you get in the original, in Josephus, the surviving manuscripts, and in Eusebius, which fairly closely matches that, that's original, that's correct, and that the others are translations. And when a person translated a text, the tendency was to soften it, not to harden it. And so they're translating it into they're sanding down the edges a little bit, like, he couldn't have said it that harshly or whatever. And so I would just give your readers, maybe it's on the screen there for them to pause or whatever and read that. But it's very similar, though, and it's only minor in terms of what's being said. It's not like a whole repudiation of the original there. And so I would say that there you're dealing with actual text criticism and translation issues, and people softening what certainly landed as a harsh, jarring kind of interruption in Josephus's history there. And so
okay, I just figured I'd ask you on that before we ended up not bringing that back up. So, Rick, is there anything we need to discuss pertaining to this Josephus Testimonium Flavianum that you really wanted to get off your chest? I don't know if you want to mention the James passage, or if it's just not that big of a passage to you, since the Testimonium is so big.
I think there's more we could talk about with all of that. There's tributaries coming off of this in so many directions that we can unpack. But I think that was kind of the core kind of bomb I wanted to drop on this, is that this was an intentional redaction, and not that the original was neutral, but it was a stain. It was seen as so ugly that it required action, government action. They're the only ones that would have had the power to go out and actually affect this change so effectively and so thoroughly across the empire in these civic libraries, into text that was owned and governed and published originally by the Roman government, so to speak, at least funded by them and distributed. And so they saw ownership of this in some way, and also saw the right in some way to go ahead and alter it. And so this is a revision.
Oh man. Okay. So I got some super dupers. If you're ready for some super chats, we could take some questions.
Yeah.
And because maybe one of them already have the question, and if they don't answer or ask it, I'll ask my question to you. But I thought there was one in here, so let's start with JC in the house. JC, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Really appreciate it. Does Dr. Miller think Eusebius was behind the Testimonium Flavianum forgery and interpolation? Also, the insertion about James in a text really about a different person?
Those good questions. Thanks, JC. Let's see. So we kind of touched on the first half of your question there, the Eusebius and the TF, the Testimonium. Was Eusebius the guy behind all that? I don't think so. Given what I've read of Eusebius, I don't think he was that. I don't think that matches kind of his mode and kind of manner of operation, is to go and, hey, let's go and alter this. Now, he was propagandistic. He was trying to paint a rosy color, but even at the beginning of his history there, he starts out saying, I'm going to go back and try and find historical sources here, as you and I have talked about in prior video, Derek, and he kind of throws up his hands and says, this is a doubtful project. This is going to, may God help us as we trying, because I haven't found anything here that's of historical value or any predecessor to myself. And so it's pretty damning, actually, as he kicks off the first thing. And so, and I think that shows a measure of honesty in him. I mean, he is a Christian, and he's commissioned to write a pro-Christian work that is going to paint a positive, even drawing from legends and things, and not the most honest historiographical fashion. But I don't think he's prone to just rewrite an entire, civic established work from centuries prior that wasn't owned by the Christians at all. And so I don't think that he was. Now, he might have known about it, though. That's something I'm open to. But I think it was prior to him by 10 or 20 years, maybe.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm just looking at the kind of the grain of the evidence. In terms of James, that's an open question. Which James is he talking about there? But it seems that there was a moment when James, one of the early Christian leaders, whether it's Jesus' brother or whomever, was executed. We do have sources for that, and so, or killed rather, in some sort of spectacle in Jerusalem. And so I'm open to the idea that's that the text is referring to that.
Okay. Thank you, JC. IX, LX, I think it's IX, but thank you for the super chat, my friend. It's Eusebian, quote unquote, in those times, not Josephus. He wrote God uses Greeks to prep for Jesus, and deception like Plato's Republic, big lie to enshrine sacred.
Yeah.
So I think they're saying that Eusebius uses language like in those times, I guess, in the Greek. I have heard someone actually, and I can't remember which scholar it was, say they thought it wasn't Eusebius himself, but a student of Eusebius that they thought might have been acquainted with Eusebian language.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, this is stuff way above my pay grade.
Well, yeah, the syntactical patterns are there, and there's other words and stuff that comes from that period and in his circles. And so I just don't think he would have been responsible for this, but I'm fine. If you think he did it, it's fine. It doesn't really tear down what I've been presenting. If you think he's the guy, okay, then he was the guy that got to rewrite book 18 or whatever. Okay. And I do think it would require swapping out that entire book and all of these major libraries, and so I don't think he was the guy that was sent to all the major libraries traveling around. They probably had emissaries or whatever, but in terms of having language that's similar, I think we could talk about the context of Eusebius and some of the people that wrote in terms of the writers, scribes, folks that had that writing talent that were on the Roman payroll at that time, probably used similar language because they were part of the same decades and the same kind of milieu and the same, trained by the same folks and all that. And so, I would open that up a little bit to not be so close to just, it's got to be that guy. But I think for some of the reasons that I suggested before, though, I see reason to doubt that he was the guy. But, if we found out that he was, if we could get in a time capsule and watch, some kind of HBO kind of
it wouldn't shock you
around, and it happened to be that Miller was wrong in that, I'd be happily wrong, and I would enjoy the show. But
I would too. Thank you so much for the super chat, my friend. Man, Bear Pig in the house. Is paradoxon ergon poietes, I think that's how you say it, or poietes, distinctly a Eusebian phrase? Josephus uses, is it poietes? Poietes? I don't know how to pronounce it. To mean poet elsewhere?
It's to make. It's somebody that makes things and this kind of thing. So a doer of paradoxical works of work, ergon there is the idea of work, and you could see paradoxon there as the paradox, and so a doer of paradox. So in terms of it being a phrase, let's just say that the language, those words there are common Greek words, and so I wouldn't really necessarily get too caught up in the phrasing of that as special to a particular writer necessarily, because those are just stock words out of the kind of the diction of that period for centuries, actually. And so if you saw that phrase in Eusebius elsewhere, that would be interesting. It's possible that Eusebius himself is copying from Josephus in that. Maybe he sees this, maybe he's emulating actually the redaction out of the Josephine redaction. And so it's possible that he's echoing language that's in there himself. And so that it could go the other direction there. But I'm open-minded. I think if at the very least you have to be open to the idea that this was language that was circulating at his time period. And so if you find echoes in Eusebius elsewhere of some of this stuff, then at the very least it indicates that this is something that would have possibly been written during that time period, because it echoes some of the grammatical kind of patterns that you find.
Well put. Well said. Thank you, Man Bear Pig. So Solera Knight, thank you for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Dr. Miller, did Josephus mention anything about the Israelites that escaped, fled Rome? The 144,000 that left the area as the Roman invasion begins, 68 to 70 AD. Reference Luke 21:20 through 24.
Oh, that's a separate question. I've got to put on my hat here. So we have information that they fled the area. They went north into the Decapolis. So there are sources, and I'm not sure if Josephus. I don't think Josephus records a lot of what happens with the Christians, by the way, just to kind of fill that in. But we do have ancient sources that suggest that Christians fled. That whole thing in Mark 13 about when you see this happening, then flee to the mountains. And this sort of thing, the little apocalypse that's in Mark and gets carried through the other synoptics. You get this idea of fleeing. And so you have to think, okay, that probably echoes something that went on in some way, even if it's post eventu or whatever. Then we do have evidence that they fled northward. And we also have evidence later that they continued fleeing northward to Antioch. And so that's where you get the kind of the track northward from that area. And so in terms of early Christian flight from the region when the Romans invaded, that would have been a profoundly disruptive set of events or set of years through that period or through that region. Kind of bulldozers coming through there. It would have been horrifying. And they sort of erased the picture culturally of what was going on there in some ways. It would have been highly disruptive, tumultuous period through there. And so it's understandable that the Christians fled and even created, apocalyptic discussion about what all that meant.
Yeah, I know Josephus doesn't mention a number of 144,000. I know he mentions that as the Romans, tighten their grip prior to war, there are people escaping clearly, but it doesn't mention 140. That's Book of Revelation. So I imagine they're connecting both to make the dots line up here. And I get it because you mentioned Revelation 18 earlier about them gladly or gleefully enjoying the destruction of Rome. And the language of that author, come on. What do you call it? Mystery Babylon. But this is like a prostitute language, whore language, like just clearly. Yeah.
Not respectful, which is the opposite of what Rome expected from its people. The majestas of the empire, the majesty of the empire. This was on the law books. You weren't supposed to spit on that. If you're caught disgracing the emperor or the majesty of the empire, you were held accountable. They had serious laws on the books for this. And so these books are running roughshod right over some of those legal issues. And doing it in a thinly veiled fashion, with kind of metaphor and this kind of thing.
Interesting. Again, thank you for the super chat, my friend. JC in the house with a 5. Thank you for that. Could Origen's ugly text just be silent on Jesus? Jesus seems like an alter ego of Judas the Galilean and other rebels that later authors used as models.
Yeah, and I'm not closed-minded to that. It's a good proposal. I think, that there's one of the things, there is a tendency in this field to come with dogmatism. And there are some points that I am borderline dogmatic on. You know this, Derek, that I take a stand on some things pretty hard in places. This is one where you have to, I think as a historian, you have to step back and be a little more open-handed, a little bit more or less fixated on it has to be, this is the only thing that could have happened. You have to be comfortable with uncertainty, with fragmentary data, with, not having all the facts.
Yeah.
And this kind of thing. And so you're extrapolating, you're deriving from scraps of data, from pieces and theory and stuff, trying to reconstruct a model of what took place. And so the idea then that there was it sounds like he's saying there that he was silent on Jesus. In other words, maybe there was another figure described there. And so they pasted over the top of that figure and put stuff about Jesus. So the problem there is that Jesus he was just silent on Jesus. So in Origen's view, though, what he says there is that he rejected that Jesus was the Christ. So if you go back and read Origen's, it's his commentary on Matthew, actually written in the middle of the 3rd century, like around 250 or something like this. And so he says that he rejected, and then he says later that Josephus wasn't far off the truth when it came to the idea that James had been one of the causes for one of the pretexts for the Jewish war, or whatever, that, this idea of killing an innocent man or something like this, that Josephus has some line in there that suggests that this was not the right move. And so it says that he's not far off. Well, not far off the truth, but he was far off the truth if he got the whole, the big question wrong that Jesus was the Christ. He was wildly off of the truth. And so we would expect then that passage there to provoke the Roman government to go ahead and redact it entirely and to spend all the money and energy to do that.
Yeah.
And then to have Origen, who's saying he's seeing not what is there, he's seeing a guy that's rejecting Jesus as the Christ. And so, and that might be Origen's nicest way of putting it, because he's obviously not going to bring out Josephus in all of his ugliness. And the report was probably embarrassing and he wants to gloss over it. He doesn't want to hey, let's unpack all this. Right.
So you're saying it seems to you, he's at least saying enough to say he's seeing something. And it's not just, he was Jesus, brother of James, or James, brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. That's not enough to say that he's not the Christ, but that Josephus had to have said something that clearly indicated this guy is in that long list of not Christs.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe in there you could try and speculate further and say maybe there was something in there, there were people that were hailing him as a Christ falsely, in Josephus, and this happened and that happened, and then they killed him. You can imagine the text there that probably, that certainly was there, give or take. And so there was probably a mention, the so-called Christ guy, that guy that this kind of a text where it's people were starting to make these claims about him and he got stamped out. This sort of thing, but that's not the same thing as this kind of flattering, and I think there were probably some uglier stains in there as well. So ugly that the Roman government felt a need to go in there and completely, get out the big eraser and
the Christian Roman.
The Christian Roman emperor needed to go in to say this is problematic for our governance throughout the empire for this to be the case. And so it was seen as a problem to their objectives as an empire.
Interesting. Thank you, JC. I appreciate the support, my friend. On the quest, thank you for that super chat. Big super chat. No church father quotes Testimonium Flavianum before Eusebius. If the Testimonium Flavianum was negative, why wouldn't a dozen church fathers try and refute it, including Justin, Irenaeus, Clement, Tertullian, etc., until the 4th century? Irenaeus and Origen actually mentioned chapter 18.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think part of it is that this existed in civic libraries. It's not quoted or dealt with by hardly anyone, actually, the entirety of Josephus' works. And so I don't think they were in heavy circulation. I don't think everyone had this on their shelf. And so we have a few, I'm talking about non-Christian quotations from Josephus. It's scanty. There's a few for the first, like, say, 3 centuries after he wrote. But not anywhere near what you would hope to see in terms of it. So I think it was a set of texts that were circulating in major libraries only. This wasn't something that was in every town and hovel, and so and therefore it was probably not terribly interesting and probably not terribly well known to a lot of these figures, and so. That's why, and it's embarrassing. So why deal with it? Why bring that out into the public if most of the public doesn't know about the work? Why drag that out and have a fight with it?
That's why I was going to ask it. And here's a hypothetical reverse question, and tell me what you think about this, Rick. How many Christians in the first 3-4 centuries are dealing with Tacitus' quote? How many of them are spending an arm and a leg dealing with Suetonius? I mean, honestly, how many are actually taking the time to address these quotes that are negative as hell toward the Christians?
Right.
If I don't see them doing that by the boatload in any of these names, then why would I expect them to have done that with Josephus, especially if they are in that elite library that you would find Josephus's writings along with these other mentions of Christians. In one of them, Christians are cannibals. They're like, it's the most evil, nasty, this horrific disease of a religion. Like, I don't see the Christians, but maybe there's a quote or two, but I don't think it's like a prevalent, common thing they're refuting. That's why I brought up earlier Marcion, because he is Christian. It's like, it's a hot issue because he's like right there and they know. Whereas who gives a shit about this guy, Josie? Who cares about the Roman elite? That guy who doesn't believe in Jesus so much. He's not having the impact Marcion is right down the street. So I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
Lenny's letter to Trajan is similar. Yeah, there's stuff there like that. Why don't they deal with that? Well, I think you're exactly right. I think you made a perfect point there in terms of, this was just not in their policies. It wasn't in their kind of domain or context of stuff that they were trying to engage. And it mostly wasn't even in the public domain. These were civic documents that were understood and read by elites and governors and people that had, reason to read them. And so,
they followed up with an interesting one. If I may comment on this, and you probably have heard this from Dennis McDonald too. So thank you again for the follow-up comment, and thank you for the big super chat. I just want to address this because of that. But Luke uses Josephus, which I think Steve Mason's on the money here. Why does Dr. Miller say Josephus was not well known? Sorry, not convinced. Well, let me make one comment, and then I want you to defend yourself however you want here. Okay, Dennis McDonald told me we have a show coming up, and he incorporated this into his new book. His new book that's coming out. I can't wait to get this thing so the world can see what he's done, because it's such a great artistic reconstruction. Dennis says Luke does know Josephus, and Dennis thinks Luke knows the dirty, naughty picture of Jesus. So Dennis actually is going to make an interesting case to point out Luke is painting, in contrary to Book 18, in Luke's Acts, this author is actually fixing the narrative using Josephus and having Jesus portrayed in a much better light than what he sees is in Josephus. So anyway, please, I'm sorry.
I think that's correct. I think that you don't have to postulate that everyone knew Josephus for you to say that's a different thing that we're saying here. No one needs to know Josephus to say that Luke's knowing Josephus and he's using Josephus as kind of a foil or, as to counterpoint from him. And so I think he's trying to counter some of the picture that's there. He's also trying to work with some of the storyline in terms of trying to bake his legend into historical kind of grit. and this kind of thing. And so he's using certain aspects there, and I'm not opposed to that. But the idea that I don't think you need the reader to know Josephus in order for them to appreciate what's going on in Luke. In fact, that I don't think that that's what's going on. And so I don't know what Dennis is thinking with that. I've had breakfasts with him about this, and we've talked about it to some extent, but I don't think that people were sitting down with Josephus in one hand and Luke in the other and having these readings. I just don't see that that's not realistic. Let me put it to you this way. Josephus's books would have been a fortune to print, own, circulate, a fortune. And very, very, very few people would have been able to make copies of that stuff. He wrote a lot, all of the books and I've got the Loeb volumes in there. Heck, it's a whole shelf of just him. And so, it would have been a bloody fortune to try and produce that. And for anyone to have their own personal copies of it, I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. There would have been maybe a handful, you could probably count on one hand the individuals that may have had copies of that. And so it would have been in the civic libraries, and the access to that would have been limited to certain circles and people. It would have been in government libraries, and access to that would have been limited to certain circles and people. And it just so happens that Origen had access to those things because he was in Alexandria and then he was in Caesarea Maritima, where we know that there were, large civic libraries. And so he did have access to those things.
So you're just saying not everybody would have had access to this. And when we read Luke Acts, this pen, whoever this author is sophisticated. They have a very, very high Greek. According to the New Testament material, theirs is like one of the best, along with the book of Hebrews. But yeah, it's just something to consider. Like, did everyone, even if you were educated, and many of these fathers were they connected to these libraries, and must we demand that they have access to all the same books as all the previous Christians? Not necessary, is your point.
Yeah, no, I don't think, and just the complete absence of any quotations from anyone of Josephus, unlike Homer. We talked about Homer and how well that circulated and everyone's familiarity with that across the empire. You just don't see people talking about Josephus much at all, like near zero. And so there's just light, evidence that people engaged him at all. And so, yeah. So
okay,
that explains why there's not a lot of talk among the early fathers. I think also it explains why Luke might want to engage him, because he does want his book to have a kind of a sheen of historicizing and, trying to kind of sink it into a period that he's not maybe as fully familiar with.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Carbon, thank you. We got two more here, and please no more super chats because Dr. Miller needs to eat. So I'm late to the party. I had to reschedule this 30 minutes later. I've been looking for a new home for my family so that we can put our roots down and get comfortable. We've been renting for years, and he gave me enough time, and he said, "Hey, dinner time's coming around this time." So I know you probably smell the food. So Carbon, thank you for the super chat. Did any church fathers suspect demons of meddling with extra biblical evidence where they couldn't find any, like Justin Martyr saying Dionysus was demonic?
I'm trying to understand the question there exactly. I mean, Justin Martyr is a great example. We've talked about this, of someone who's trying to accuse demons of having orchestrated all of classical literature somehow through all the times and societies. It's a bridge too far to really even swallow, even if you've got the mythology, that you're buying into. Really, the demons were orchestrating all of classical civilization for 1,000 years. And every writer, and as they cascaded and worked off each other's, and all the complexities that went on with that. And so that's the claim, the rhetorical claim, but it's not a feasible, it's not a plausible. Even if you were to postulate that demons are real, can you imagine the busy work of the demons constantly there trying to get, a particular word and angle and text and shaping all of the poets and all of the, it just would have been, it's too much. And so it feels like more of a rhetorical claim than an actual, you push it pushes to absurdity as soon as and so, but yeah. And did any church father suspect? I don't know if suspect's the right word. How about they just used it as a rhetorical kind of posture to denigrate the classical literary tradition. And so
there are other just so the super chatter knows, you mentioned this several times to me. There are other fathers though who do use this rhetorical it was demons long ago, and it wasn't just Justin Martyr. He's not the only guy on the block, is your point.
Right. No, this was a trend, and this was a one way they had to describe things. And so they're left with, there's only so many things in their tool chest. So they have to describe why did all this happen, especially if their program is to denigrate. And so it just shows shifting attitudes and just the way they're casting shade on all of these grand writers that had preceded them and trying to eclipse that world.
And they do a good job of trying to find anything by their current philosophical moral standards to be able to denigrate. So they could find Dionysus and intoxication, or Heracles making love, or Zeus sleeping with a mortal woman, or all these, like, they can find it. They can find it. But notice that when Celsus turns the scalpel and points out the moralistic flaws and stuff, now we need to make sure they understand Jesus is the most moral, and nope, this is not evil.
That's right. I think to put it a little bit more nuance for some of your viewers that might sense something that needs to happen there, they were more vehement toward the poets and the mythologists and mythographers and the epic tradition than they were toward some of the classical philosophers. And so, according to Justin Martyr, for instance, that Socrates had the spirit of Christ in him, and so, which just sounds unbelievable, but that he would take that position. But they were trying there to co-opt the classical philosophical tradition rather than fully denigrate it. They were saying he had insights, in his early time, but we've brought it into full fruition now, this kind of thing.
Same with Plato. They did the same with Plato. Yeah. Powerful. Solera Knight, thank you for the super chat. Church fathers mean founders. What truly about Christianity is a new idea? Flavius Josephus, was Josephus a true bloodline Flavian? Who actually invented Christianity?
Oh, wow. Each one of those questions is a book, or even several books, I think. Great. I love it. Church father means founder. Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, a founder, it's not how Christians want to. So these were the elders, the leaders, the thought leaders, the however, whatever nice words you want to put on that. I've got some other words, but they were basically they were seen as the leading figures of, and so depending on if you're post-apostolic and pre-Nicene, and there's different fathers that come forward, it's very patriarchal in that way, we're all the mothers. And so what truly about Christianity is a new idea? Good question. I think it's more new in terms of its recombination of older ideas and forms. And so you could see some of my other videos about that, but I don't think it's novel in the sense of really bringing something forward that no part of it's ever been seen before. And so in that sense, it's a syncretism. It's pulling from innumerable sources to put together a kind of a recombination of things. Flavius Josephus. So Flavius, I think it's because he's got patrons that are paying for his, and this is the Flavian dynasty, and so Vespasian and so forth. And so that's where I believe he probably gets his name there, but I would defer to experts that are more focused on him, like Steve Mason.
I think he was adopted into the family of the Flavians, but the story goes by Josephus that, well, he had predicted and prophesied that he was going to be the emperor. Now, I don't know, man. I mean, maybe he's like, he's one of those guys. He's like, I have to lean into this and hope this dude really makes it. And so he prophesies, is like, listen, the Lord is saying you are the emperor, before he became the emperor.
But, he's got a tremendous sense of self-esteem. The Josephus at points, he even says that at the age of 12, he went and all the rabbis would come to him for advice and insights into the Torah. the age of 12, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, we believe it. Yep.
So I think he may be embellishing a little bit of his significance there. But I don't know. I mean, I defer to others. That's a great question, though. I'd love to explore that further. Was Josephus a true blood? Yeah, so we answered that a little bit. Yep. Who actually invented Christianity? Big topic. You could see some of my other videos on that, man. That's a whole world of stuff there. But I do think that the founders were, the original cult leaders. We've got to see it that way, I think. And so, those were the figures that crafted in some of those names we have.
Well, I thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time. Is there any final words as we promote your book here you'd like to say to our audience?
Yeah, I mean, my book is on somewhat different topics, but I do get pretty heavy into the political side, the political edge of Christianity there. And so if you like that, this is a look at the resurrection tradition from a political lens. And so you can see there I unpack some of these kinds of insights there, though I don't get so much into Josephus, but just the political edge and a kind of aggravation of the group with regard to some of its proclamation and messaging and this kind of thing. I think regarding Josephus, though, I think it's a big deal if you say that if what I'm saying is correct, that's a major, major shift change in terms of how we view Christian origins, because that aligns Jesus with some of the other stock figures. It places him, it locates him back into the fabric of that time period and the patterns that Josephus identifies through that period and region. And so, and that's important to, to draw that back. And so if you want to say that he didn't exist, that's fine. Josephus is still wanting to paint him as one of those characters. And so it could be just built on his reputation, so to speak, the counter language that's circulating regarding him. And so if you're a mythicist and want to run that direction, I think there's room. And so the hypothesis can still stand. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Get the book. There's this awesome, clever person who I heard was being like all of the leaders in America came to him at age 12 and learned from him. His name is Derek Lambert, and he's the host of this show called MythVision podcast. I don't know. I've heard about him. He's something else. Like, I hear he walks on water and all sorts of stuff, but we can't get into all that today. Please, for the very least, get the book and come and compete with your review. See if you can outdo my review in the review section. Seriously. But I love you, man. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Miller. Let's do this again, brother.
You're the best, Derek. Love you back, man.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, hit the like button, share this thing out there, drop a comment after the live stream. We love you, and never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.